Good evening. I am your bard, your storyteller, your curator of tales, your teller of stories. I am Archibald, and welcome to another fabulously creepy stories, episode 16. I apologize for the delay. We had some technical difficulties, and as you can tell earlier, still had a few more to iron out. Hopefully, the visuals and audio levels are working just fine, for the most part. Now, since it is the festive season, the holidays are here, people are merry in the streets, people are feeling given and hopeful. Well, that's not what tonight is about. So how about we have a few Christmas horror stories to get us in the mood? I believe I'll keep that theme for the rest of the month. So, our first story. Let's see. Now this comes from Creepypasta, as many of our stories do. This story is called The Chimney Man, written by Pen Phantom 13. So let's begin. Yes, Star King, that's right. We did have a few audio hiccups. Please let me know if the audio is coming in clear. We might have some volume issues at the moment. So back onto the story. My dad built his dream cabin in the Southern Quarks back in 1991. A reward to himself for achieving early retirement. The damn thing took nearly a year to build. What with the country having an actual build the road to my family's property at the top of the small mountain. I was 14 at the time, and yes, we were wealthy. But the cabin didn't reflect that. It was simple, unlike most of the monstrosities you see in places like Aspen these days. And at that age, I was ruined into thinking that I'd rather live in a city, where I'd have an easier time being spoiled rotten. I despise being there, to say the least. We moved into the cabin in midwinter, a couple of weeks before Christmas. Everyone was excited, except me, to be moving in to enjoy Christmas morning in front of... I'm sorry, that sentence read a bit weird. Everyone was excited, except me, to be moving in and to enjoy Christmas morning in front of the big fireplace my dad gloated over. Amelia, my little sister, was 6 at the time, and she was elated that Santa would have such an easy entry point. Our old house didn't even have a chimney. Looking back, the first day was an omen, but there was no way we could have known. We pulled up to the cabin around noon on December 12th. My sister's playing Kirby Dream Land on her Game Boy, and me listening to Nirvana on my Walkman. Again, I was not excited. Mom and Dad were chipper, as usual, and it was grating on my nerves. My dad wouldn't shut up about how he had the fireplace hooked up into the central system so that all the heat would be distributed evenly throughout the house. We all began unloading what we had in the back of the Bronco. Everything else having been moved in, at great expense, a few days before. My father's annoyingly happy face dropped into a mid-frown when he shouldered open the front door. Looks like the movers didn't care too much about the new carpet, he said sarcastically. There in the living room, starting where the wood floors ended and from the foyer, was a trail of footprints in the carpet, apparently made with soot, leading from just in the front of the entry, to the fireplace, to the back door. I snorted at my father's comment, which earned me a side-eye for the ages from my mom. We sat down what we were carrying in our respective rooms, and of course, I was tasked with cleaning up the mess while my dad called the moving company to complain. Whilst I was scrubbing and fuming, it occurred to me that if the footprints were in fact soot, then it would be hard to explain why the fireplace had already been used in a brand new cabin. At the time, I assumed that there had been a test run by the builder to ensure everything was in working order. It took me about an hour to bring the carpet to my parents' satisfaction, and then I promptly went to my new room and continued wallowing in my teenage angst. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched in the shower, that someone was standing just on the other side of the curtain. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling worsened when I closed my eyes to wash my hair and face. Finally, I pulled back the curtain, feeling foolish for being such a wimp. Of course, I found nothing unusual. I wrote my paranoia off as just being pissed off from the move and didn't think much of it. I didn't have another strange encounter for several days, but about a week after, I got the shower stalker vibe. Amelia let my mom and I know about her new friend at the breakfast table. "How did everyone sleep last night?" my mother asked, trying to get through my solemn disdain. "Fine," I replied, through a mouthful of scrambled eggs. "I played with the man behind the curtains," Amelia explained. "I told him that he would be in big trouble if he kept getting the rug dirty." "Oh, that's wonderful, honey," my mom said. "I'm glad you made a friend. Tell them I said thank you for not getting any more stains in the carpet." It made me bitter, listening to my mom placate my sister while I was in the social isolation. Mom just kept sipping her coffee and reading the newspaper that Dad paid extra to have delivered out in this far-off wilderness. There was no fear in my sister's voice, and neither of us even remotely considered the possibility that her new friend was anything more than her imagination. Later that day, I was taking some folded laundry to my sister's room. I put it in her drawer, turned and walked out, and I saw them. 2 charcoal footprints under the window curtain, as if someone had been hiding there. Initially, I disregarded them as leftovers from the moving crew, just like the others. I ignored them. Let Mom clean them up, I thought to myself. But it kept nagging at me. I'd help Amelia get settled into her room, and I would have noticed them. They weren't there before. I still don't know why, but I never told my parents about them. I ultimately did go back to clean them up, and carried on. Amelia surely had made them somehow as part of her relationship with her new friend. That night, December 23rd, I had trouble sleeping. The feeling that I was being watched had returned shortly after the discovery in Amelia's room, and I hadn't been able to shake it. I hadn't admitted to myself yet, but a microscopic part of my imagination had begun to suspect something amiss. At 14, I still hadn't quite squashed my fear of ghosts. I kept looking across the room, into the back of the open closet, half expecting someone to be standing there, their shoes covered in black dust. I felt shame for being scared, but finally, I drifted off sometime around midnight. I still can't remember what woke me. I just know that my sheets were damp with sweat when I came to. I felt again that I was being watched, and I began scanning the dark room through my blurry, just waking up vision. I followed the curtains down to the floor, and saw them, soiled, black feet poking out from beneath them. I jumped a bit, then rubbed my eyes to look back. There were no shoes, but the curtain was moving ever so slightly. I looked at my closet door, which had been shut without a sound. Cowering, I pulled my blankets up over my head, knowing that if I pulled them down, something would be there, sitting at the end of my bed. After a while, I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Of course, I was blamed the next day for the dirty tracks, too, and for my mom. They began and ended at the front of the fireplace, just like the first time, but they clearly led to my bedroom, closet, and back. My parents gave me a big speech about how I needed to accept my new circumstances and start treating everyone and everything with a lot more respect. I didn't have the energy to fight with them. All I could think about were the footprints and the thing that had spent the night with me. I just rolled my eyes and accepted my punishment, cleaned up the prints, and then no Walkman until I straightened up. It wasn't like they believed me, so why say anything? I scrubbed the carpets that day in a daze, remembering what Amelia had said a few days before breakfast. My thoughts raced for rational explanations, but I kept arriving at this strange algorithm of Ghost and Santa Claus. Despite everything going on, I still had Christmas morning in my mind, just like anyone around that age. Yet, by the time I had finished cleaning, I had resigned myself to try and sort out what was going on. I would start with my sister. That night, after an almost silent dinner, I went to Amelia's room to do some gentle prying. As I rounded the doorframe, I found her staring up at the ceiling vent. The floor around her bed was covered in that morning's newspapers. "What's all this for?" I asked, trying to remain calm despite already knowing the answer. "For the man that likes to hide in the curtains," she almost whispered. "I told him I would keep the floor clean. He doesn't like leaving tracks because he's afraid I'll have to leave if Mommy and Daddy find out about him. He said that if I did that for him, he'd take me to visit his house. He said that there are lots of other kids there that could play with." All of this she said as a matter of fact, as if she and the man had been friends for years, and I should have known these things. I almost lost what little cool I had left. My eyes widened, and my mouth opened to scorn her for being so naive, but I caught myself, resolving to try and solve the mystery on my own, without shaming a 6-year-old girl. As appalling as it was, I decided to use my sister as bait, to catch whoever, or whatever, was leaving the damn footprints in the carpet and possibly planning a kidnapping. "Okay," I began. "Just make sure you tell Mom and Dad that all the newspapers for watercolors or something. That way they don't get suspicious." "I will," she replied enthusiastically. Thank God Amelia was 6 and didn't need a lot of explanation. I left her room with terrified curiosity, wondering what Christmas Eve would have in store. For what seemed like to be 100th time, I laid in bed, unable to fall asleep. I watched my clock tick for seconds, minutes, hours. I knew that should anything actually arrive in Amelia's room, I'd hear the crumbling of paper. I also knew that Amelia would be awake, desperate not only for her new friend to come out, but also for the sound of sleigh bells. Just as I began to drift, something around one in the morning, I heard it. The sound of rustling newspaper. I hoisted myself out of the sleeping awake twilight I was in and ejected myself from the bed, too stricken with urgency to consider being quiet. I landed on the floor with a thud, and immediately I heard my sister whine from across the hall. "Please, don't go! No, come back!" she cried. I raced out of my bedroom, older sibling protective instincts in full tilt, and into the hallway, and just in time to be stopped in my tracks. A tall, willowy silhouette stood in the living room end of the hallway. The thing, a man, stood so tall that it stooped, bending at the ceiling, using its long, spindly arms to brace against the walls. The lunar glow coming in through the skylight was just enough to show me that it was uniformly pale, almost paper white, and without clothes. I stared up at what I thought should be a face, its lack of features slightly disorienting. It had 2 indentations where it should have been eyes, as if there once were sockets but skin had been stretched over them. I thought I saw a small slit that must have been its mouth. I began to notice that its body seemed thin, almost two-dimensional, and then it moved. I gasped, as it moved with unnatural motion, as if its joints were the result of being seized and folded into a box. Using its abnormally gangly arms to balance on the floor and lurch to the living room. For a moment, I considered going back to my room, but I'd come too far. I summoned what little courage I had and edged towards the living room, peeking around the corner of the hallway's end. In the moonlight, I followed the trail of grayish footprints with my eyes up to the fireplace, where the twin doors into the hearth stood open. I caught a glimpse of a limb being retracted into the chimney. I just stared, not daring to move, not daring to breathe too loudly or deeply, lest it come back for me. Amelia broke me from my trance. "Don't hurt him!" she whispered meekly from behind me. I spun around, startled, my heart thumping in my chest. We locked eyes for a moment, me not believing what I've seen, Amelia not comprehending why I seemed so disabled. Finally, I found the words. "Go back to bed, Amelia," I stammered. "No, he won't hurt you, he won't!" She started to tear up. I kept finding myself unable to speak, as if this thing in our fireplace had stolen my vocabulary. I just kept standing there, watching Amelia weep as if I was taking away a new puppy. In my head, I was sprinting, trying to weigh out the options. I took Amelia by the hand and went into the hallway closet for my dad's Maglite. I crept back to the fireplace, Amelia mercifully not fighting my grip. I sat for a moment. "Amelia, if anything happens when I look up in the chimney, you run and wake up Mom and Dad. Do you understand?" Amelia nodded. I took a deep breath and I leaned back into the fireplace as I turned on the flashlight and looked up. A sheet white face met mine, the creature hanging upside down and craning its neck to face me. There were no eyes, but a round black hole for a mouth, gaping to reveal a seemingly bottomless oblivion. I scrambled out of the hearth and collapsed there on the floor, waiting for it to come out after me, and my chest heaved, but it never did. At some point, I got up, ignoring my sister's questions and pleadings, as a numb, thoughtless state came over me. I took the fireplace matches, doused the carpet in lighter fluid, from the kitchen to the cabinet, and set the carpet ablaze. That place be damned. Amelia and I never told our parents what happened, and I can't remember much of what happened in the immediate aftermath. After hundreds of hours of therapy, the only solid thing I could retrieve after looking up in the chimney that horrifying Christmas morning is sitting out in the snow with my family, pulling my knees to my chest as we waited for the fire department from the distant town, Amelia wailing about her friend burning alive. By the time the fire trucks got there, the cabin had burned to the ground. None of the firemen even bothered turning on their hoses. The therapists tell my parents that I've got repressed memories as a result of being so miserably sequestered from society at a time where social development is paramount. What a bunch of BS. Amelia wouldn't talk to me for a long time because of her perspective. I've murdered her friend. A few years later, she began to comprehend. We talked, we reconciled, and we agreed never to speak of it. The fire was attributed to a likely electrical problem within the system that distributed the heat from the fireplace. I guess small-town forensic scientists don't know much about accelerants, like I do. My parents never quite understood why Amelia was convinced that I had caused the fire when the fire department said otherwise. It strained us for a while, but eventually, I guess they just let it go as Amelia's vivid imagination. The day after, we were allowed to sift through the smoldering rubble to try to salvage anything that we could. All that we found was a set of footprints that led into the woods, and it didn't return to the house. We followed them, but eventually they disappeared abruptly. My parents don't know who they could have possibly belonged to, but Amelia and I do. And that is the end of that tale. Ah, Amberger and Shaolin. Welcome to the stream, and thank you so much for that ice cream cone. It's very much appreciated. Let's see, Amberger says that Tetris 99 got an update. Congratulations, Amberger. I'm sure that Choppy is eagerly waiting to compete against you in that game. I myself shall stick to my books. Speaking of which, let's immediately head off into our next story. Ah, here we go. This story is called The Christmas Tree, written by Michael Whitehouse. This story can also be found on creepypasta.com. And yes, thank you Star King for your lemon, that is very much appreciated. So let's begin our story. Staring at the tree, whiskey in hand, Pete was pleased that this year's would be different from the last. It had been the strangest time of his life, but he truly felt like things were finally coming together. And when better to come together than in Christmas, a time he loved more than any other. In some ways, the past year had been like an eternity. In others, as if it had succumbed to time in a blink of an eye. But either way, he was glad to see it back to it. Staring at the Christmas tree, its beautiful lights casting a warm hue over the room, and the snow quietly falling outside of the sunset, Pete began to think of the past year, of his daughters, Lana, and his wife, Janet. It had started with a very normal December 12th, months earlier. The small town in which they lived was covered in a thick layer of snow, the residents spending most of their days clearing driveways, and Pete's wife going off on one of her usual wanders. She had been gone for a couple hours, but while Janet was utterly devoted to her family, she still needed moments to herself, to clear her head, to diminish the stress that comes with a loving yet disorganized husband, and a little girl who was kind, but whom enjoyed trying her parents' patience as much as possible. When the tensions of the domestic life clouded her feelings, or began to weigh on her spirits, Janet will wander out to the back door of the fields and the woodlands which characterized the entire area, and trek for a little while through the pines which dotted the landscape. It therefore wasn't unusual for her to be gone for fairly long periods, especially since it was around that time of year when she would take it upon herself to choose the Christmas tree. No matter how much Pete and Lana asked to help out, that was Janet's job. She loved the tradition of it, the process of choosing the best possible tree, cutting it down, and then seeing the bright smiles of her family's faces, as they would gleefully take up the tree indoors and decorate it with sparkling lights and ganders, warm glowing lights, and an array of festive baubles. It was a small highland town where they lived, far away from the major city, but Janet and the rest of her family loved their home. The simplicity of it. Ooh, excuse me, it looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulties here. Let me see if I could fix this up real quick. Sorry about that. Hopefully it didn't interrupt the story too much. So now, where were we? It was a small highland town where they lived, far away from any major city. But Janet and the rest of her family loved their home. The simplicity of it, the feeling of being an integral part of the close-knit community, and of course, the beautiful surroundings. Lush during the Scottish high summer, and cold, crisp, stark, but yet awe-inspiring into winter. Most importantly, she loved the pine woods nearby, specifically a collection of trees which sat at the top of a small hill within walking distance from the house, perfect for picking a Christmas tree. She would return there each year, and while their numbers thinned due to a few other neighbors going there for the exact same purpose, there were enough trees to last a good many years. When she had been gone for 3 hours, Pete began to grow nervous, as this was longer than usual. And since it was getting dark, he took it upon himself to venture outside, telling Lana to lock the doors after him, and then he would not be long. Lana laughed when he told her that he would be expecting Mommy was struggling through the snow with a huge tree, bigger than any other that they have ever had. Pete loved to see the excitement in his daughter's face, and this time of year, and he told her to watch from the bedroom window to see what they would bring back. With this, she excitedly ran up the stairs straight to her window before he had to call her back down to lock the door. Gazing at the beautiful tree, he could remember that night like it was yesterday. The snow was crisp on the ground and crunched under his feet as he began to freeze. Small flakes fell from the sky occasionally, but Janet's footprints remained uncovered. Even without them, Pete knew where they were headed. The hill where Janet returned each year was only a 40-minute hike away. She would pick a pine tree from there. In fact, sometimes she picked two. One around 6 feet and the other young tree about half that size. If they could find one suitable. It was difficult at times to find smaller trees, as they seemed to be rare in this area. Everyone in town seemed to like the smaller trees, and they liked the idea of having a small tree for their children's bedroom. So people would climb up there with an axe and take away what they wanted. So there weren't many at hand. Lana, at one time, had thought that it was sad to cut down and kill the smaller trees just for people to look at. But Pete explained to her about the tradition and that he was sure more would grow back. With time, she forgot this protest and looked forward to the years when she could have one. If a smaller tree couldn't be found, they have a lovely synthetic one in which they will sit in the window. Secretly, she loved this just as much. Just as her father had said, tradition is tradition. The larger tree would be placed in the living room and adorned with an assortment of baubles, glittering decorations, and lights. The other, in Lana's room, would be sprayed with a can of fake snow and covered in hanging candlesticks and chocolates. Although she was always told that she could only have one a day before bed as a treat. Of course, occasionally, she would break the rule and just hope no one would notice. Janet could always tell, but she would let it go. Christmas time was just the best times after all, and it was always so brief. As Pete approached the hill, he knew something was wrong. He felt it in his bones. As he climbed, the snow began to fall in greater volume, and the sky dimmed with it. Standing at the humble summit, a stillness spread, silence interrupted momentarily by the almost audible patter of snowflakes floating gently to the ground. He followed the footprints now with purpose, knowing that if the snowfall increased, that it would be nearly impossible to find Janet. Twilight fell, covering everything in dark blue wisp of color, as the frost began to nip at his rosy nose and cheeks. The footprints bobbed and weaved in a way through the huge pines, finally stopping next to a wonderfully thick and vibrant tree, one which was perfectly suited for their purposes. Next to the perfect size, almost 7 feet tall, a deep life-filled green, and a thick abundance of branches and pines, which made it almost impossible to visually penetrate its cover from the light. But yet Janet was nowhere to be seen. As far as Pete could tell, there were no more tracks in the snow leading anywhere in any direction. She had almost certainly been here, but where had she gone? This was both puzzling and worrying. It seemed impossible, but there they were, Janet's last 2 footprints, engraved in the ground, but the snow all around it, virgin, undisturbed, and lacking any signs of life. It was as if she just vanished into the night. Looking at the base of the tree, Pete ran his fingers over the deep gash in the tree trunk. There was no doubt about it. Janet had taken a few swipes at it with her axe. Then, for some unknown reason, she had left. Or perhaps moved the tree that she felt was more suitable. Surely not, though. This tree was perfect. That must have been it, though. She must have moved on. Perhaps there was some random freakish flurry of snow which covered her tracks. Yes, that must have been it. But Pete knew that this was wishful thinking. He had lived there for years, and in all of that time, he had never seen such a thing. And then he saw it. Several meters away, lying in the snow, was Janet's axe. He rushed over to the object, falling once the snow deepened, rising to his feet as it's now unmistakable. Yes, it was partially covered in snow, but it was Janet's axe, all right. It lay there much like the footprints, isolated, but with the absence of any human imprints. It was as if the tool had been dropped from a great height, but Pete did not care to speculate. A sense of growing worry permeated his mind as the thought of Janet laying somewhere injured increased with anxiety. Shouting his wife's name repeatedly drew no reply as darkness now began to creep over closer. If his wife was hurt, he would have raised the alarm to get the town out to look for her, along with the mountain rescue. She wouldn't survive long in the snow, in this biting cold. At this thought, his panic grew. Worry, fear, hurt that can only be felt through love. With torch in hand, he continued in the direction that the axe had taken him. As he entered a thick den of pine trees, he noticed the broken branches littered the ground, as if something had been rushed past there, tearing them apart and breaking them off on impact. Maybe Janet ran through here. The scale of the damage, however, looked too great to have been dealt by one person alone. Had he been in any other country, he would have assumed a bear was nearby. But they had been hunted to extinction in Scotland long ago, along with the wolves and any other predators. For a moment, his torch reflected off as something scuttling across the bush, but it looked more like an insect than anything else. And again, far too small to cause such a devastation. Pete fixed his scarf, trying to cover his face from the frost a bit deeper. But just as he did so, something caught his eye. Something on the ground. Shining his torch on what at first thought was a dead animal, was the crumpled body of Janet, lying still on the ground. A heart attack, they said. A heart attack! But Pete had seen her face. He had looked upon those eyes, once so filled with kindness, transfixed with a frozen stare. Cold, glassy, black with fear. Her hands were clenched in front of her, and the pathologists thought him that this was perfectly normal for one to suffer such a massive heart attack in such low temperatures. As was the controlled look on her face. Although at the mention of this, Pete saw a flicker in the pathologist's eyes, which gave away he was as puzzled at the look as anyone else. A look Pete would never forget. Darling Janet, love of his life, mother of his children, dying alone in the cold, with lips pulled back and teeth in agony, frozen into a human sneer. The whole ordeal had devastated him. If it hadn't been for their daughter Lana, for the necessity of her needs to be met before his own, Pete would have found it nearly impossible to have gone on through it. The past 12 months have been cluttered with reminders of the aching loss. As with any bereavement, the first time of doing something once shared without the person made the pain even more acute. first Christmas, the first day at work, the first walk to school, the first family get-together, every person's face etched and concerned, accompanied by the usual, well-meaning but empty traditions of, "How are you holding up?" It must have been so difficult, and if there's anything I can do. Helping his daughter through the loss of his mother was all he had to make sure that he could face another day. But that stopped now. They had been through the horror, through the denial, through the silent meals, through the lonely cries of despair at night, through the birthdays empty and somber. They had been through it all. All these first were over. It had been over 12 months since Janet's death, and Pete felt almost exhilarated by this. He still missed her every day. The pain would never truly leave, but the feeling of accomplishment, of strength, something which he thought he had deserted him, that he had endured, filled him for the first time with thoughts of a future, thoughts that life does indeed go on, even when our dearest are gone before us. And what of his beautiful daughter? Dear, kind Lana. He may have felt compelled to bring her through the past year, but her empathy and strength had left him in awe, characteristics which someone so young had no right to possess, but which were thankfully present nonetheless. When he had cried, he had been there. When she had cried, he had been there, and on more than one occasion, when he laid sobbing, staring at the empty void of space in his double bedroom at night, Lana would waken and climb into bed beside him, and they would both cry together until they fell asleep. She was his rock, and by God, she was going to have the best Christmas ever. Pete had made a number of arrangements. He had spent a fortune on every gift imaginable. He had filled the house with every food and treat that she could enjoy, and both Janet's parents and his own were flying in for Christmas dinner to be with their brave, sweet little granddaughter. He'd also organized for Lana's friends that had a sleepover on Boxing Day, which she had pledged for, or pleaded for, but Pete always knew that he would give in eventually. She never asked for much, but this year, this Christmas, would have more than she could imagine. The house was perfect, but there was one thing left to do, one thing that Pete had dreamt of since that night he found Janet's body. She had chosen that tree. It was going to be sitting in their living room adorned with all manner of decoration. That was its purpose, its very reason for being. Janet never finished cutting down the damn thing. It was in many ways her dying act, and Pete was going to make sure that it was fulfilled. On the anniversary of her death, he wandered through the snow, winding his way through the pines until he stood at the foot of the ominous little hill. The sun shone brightly, and it wasn't as cold as it had been that night Janet died, but each footstep was accompanied by sickness in the pit of Pete's stomach. Each stride a morbid reminder of the previous year, and that terrible heart attack in the snow. Marching to its peak, he first walked to, and observed the scene of Janet's untimely death. Standing there where her body had laid, Pete wiped the tears from his eyes and placed a small Santa figurine on the ground, burying it in the snow. It had always been hung from the branches of each year. It had always been hung on each yearly tree, and was her favorite decoration. It seemed only right that it be with her. After another few minutes of trudging, there it was. It was still standing, that damn tree, as if ravenous for revenge. Pete pulled Janet's axe from his backpack and charged at the pine. He battered and chopped and cut with which Janet had made a previous year, making it deeper with every slice, and every pound of pressure he could muster. The tree groaned and creaked as if in pain, but Pete did not care. That tree was a final reminder of Janet's death. Whatever had happened that night, it happened because of that tree. As crazy as it seems, it all made sense for a moment. and that clarity was clouded by mundane reality. She had simply died of natural causes. With the roar and cracked wood breaking under its own weight, the tree swooned and collapsed to the ground in defeat. Tying a rope around this trunk and then using string to fold the branches inward, Pete dragged that memory, that cold-hearted pillar of nature's brutality, through the snow, over grass and gravel, and finally to his back door. He was victorious. With little thought for the carpet and furniture, he dragged it up the stairs, into the house, and placed it in front of the window in the living room, wedging it upright into the old wooden stump that they had used the stand for every year. Breathless and covered in sweat, he stood back and looked at the tree standing tall over all it surveyed. "You picked a good one, love. You picked a good one." He held back his tears and waited for Lana to return home from her friends. Pete put an old Christmas film on the television as they both decorated the tree together, singing, laughing, and being a family. There were moments, fleeting glances when they caught one another's stare. A glance which showed pain buried deep down inside. One which said, "I miss her too." But it was Christmas, and the moment for grief passed, buffered by longer, caring periods of happiness. Contentment, caresses, smiles from ear to ear. The festive spirit once more filled the home, which had for long been hosted to a loss and anguish. As night begins to fall, after Lana went to bed, earlier than usual because of the excitement had worn her out, Pete decided to reward himself for the early day's effort. The lights were dimmed, and after pouring himself a large whiskey, he sat on the living room couch and stared at the tree, draped in tinsel garlands and adorned with a bright white Christmas lights. It really was a sight to behold, the best tree he ever had. "Here's to you, gorgeous," Pete said, lifting his drink up to the sky in a symbolic gesture. Staring at the Christmas tree, its beautiful lights casting a warm hue over the room, and the snow quietly falling outside as the sun set, Pete began to think of the past year, of his daughter Lana, of his wife Janet. Time passed slowly as he thought of all the things gone, how they had led him to this moment, through the pain and suffering, but now hopefully onwards to the future, and one filled with at least the briefest possibility of joy. The glow from the tree reflected off the window, but it penetrated far enough to illuminate the now thick blur of snow, falling to the ground silently outside. The room remained dark, but the lights bathed everything subtly in a warm, utile radiance, which, when accompanied by the orange lambency of the fire, only served to cultivate the anticipation of Christmas even so more. For the first time in a year, Pete was happy. But something bothered him, though. There was a slight apprehension or annoyance at the back of his mind. Something which was spoiling the display. Sipping at the whiskey, casting a glance at the entire room, he finally saw what the problem was. 2 of the Christmas tree lights were occasionally flickering. Not consistently, but often enough to be noticeable, and more importantly, aggravating. Drowning his drink, Pete rose to his feet, now feeling the aches in his muscles from the efforts exerted while dragging the thing in all the way to his home from the hill. Walking over to the tree, the lights were indeed flickering, but there was something unusual about them. They seemed deeper than the rest, as if coming from around the trunk rather than resting on the branches. Again, Pete was struck by how dark the interior of the tree was. That evening, in the presence of many lights placed around it, he could not peer or adequately see between the branches. Even the 2 lights, which sat deeper behind the pines, did not seem to illuminate their surroundings in any way. The empty glass slipped from his fingers, smashed into the floor. The lights were fine. They were not flickering at all, but the occasional blinking of the two eyes amongst the branches had been enough to catch his attention. He froze to the spot, and it was as if the room grew somehow darker. Something stirred between the pines, between the knotted wood, and the scratched porous surface. Something lived there. A feeling of utter paralysis now took hold. His feet firmly glued to the ground as the two eyes slowly pushed forward. Creaking and cracking, a face revealed itself from behind the pines-covered branches, as if seeping out from the innermost visual point. Mold-covered, ancient, his features twisted with rage. Fear began to course through Pete's veins. His heart beat faster and faster as the face moved closer. His eyes, devoid of pupils, now swamped in a maddening yellow. And from below, the protrusions of two thin, moss-covered legs arced out from the branches in between. With a creak and a snap, it straightened itself, now standing in all its terrible glory in front of the tree. It was now pitch black outside, and it would have been clear to Pete that this animal, this creature, was of a nocturnal nature. But in its stare he found himself helpless. His heart skipped. First, it was palpitation. Then he could feel the searing pain in his left arm. He clutched his chest, but his feet remained adhered to the ground, and it was impossible to look away from those yellow, unmarked eyes. Its gaze came closer still, and in the pain which it brought, Pete knew he was going to die. To be found like Janet, cold, face contorted, and the second victim of which lived amongst the pines on the hill. The pain was now unbearable, but the paralysis removed the possibilities of a scream. What little light there was from the fireplace now illuminated his head, elongated on one side and pulsing on the other. Its face dominated a large dark hole, which appeared in place of a mouth or nose, one which no light could penetrate. As its boiled written head stooped to meet my own, or his own, the hole in his face almost touched his mouth. An involuntary sneer pulled Pete's lips up to reveal his teeth, as his face contorted in an entirely unnatural position. Then that one word. A word so powerful, so pure that even the most evil of intentions could be dispelled by it. Daddy? With a snap of wood, the gargoyle-like creature turned its wide yellow gaze on Lana, standing there at the bottom of the stairs in her pajamas. Her scream echoed into the night. Arms outreached, his odd-numbered fingers moved with a stutter, and his moss-covered legs groaned, carrying it forward in a peculiar, unbalanced motion towards her. Now Lana was paralyzed by its stare, and with each step, her face contorted more fiercely, and the pain in her chest brought her to the point of unconsciousness. As intense as an ancient gaze was, it was focused. So focused that it did not notice Pete clawing his way across the floor towards the kitchen. The wooden creature's unsure movements made it appear more like a puppet than a thing of autonomous purpose, and as it reached Lana, it cupped her face in an uneven hand and stared wide-eyed at the pupilless into her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The sound of feet running filled the air, and as it twisted to investigate, a loud crack was heard as Pete ran up onto the couch, jumping high into the air and bringing Janet's axe down onto the spine of this creature. No blood ran or gushed, but the plague of unfamiliar insect-like critters poured out from the wood. Instead of a howl of pain, the creature emitted a crescendo of strange squeals and clicks before throwing Pete to the ground and smashing through the back door. Lana's Lana's father gave chase, but it was impossible, as the wooden creature moved at an unimaginable pace, gliding on the ground with each stride, leaving no footprints in the snow. After the visit to the nearest hospital, both Lana and her father were given a clean bill of health, but they never returned to that house. Filled with memories of good times, the happy times, of a mother, a wife, and kind soul, of birthdays and weddings, and of course, of Christmas time. Pete didn't know what the creature was, whether it was alive or dead, or something else entirely inconceivable to the human mind, but he made a solemn promise to himself, from that moment on. Never again would he cut down a tree, decorate it, and take enjoyment in its appearance as it died. Because no matter how pretty they are, no matter how much warmth they may give, no matter how much they might make people think of Christmas, you just don't know what may be living inside. And that is the end of that tale. That's why I prefer plastic trees. Well, mainly because I'm lazy. But with that said, that is the last story we're going to be reading tonight. I hope you all enjoyed the tales we told tonight. Airtoro, welcome to the stream. And no, the God King is not here tonight, it's just me. Tomorrow, Cocolito will arrive playing his Space Marine game. Let's see, Star King and Airtoro both having a little banter. I love it how you guys show up and have fun with these streams. It brings a warm feeling to my cold heart. But everything must come to an end, and you all must go to sleep to celebrate the wonderful nightmares you're sure to have. Till then, I'll be back next week. You all have a wonderful holiday season. Good night.